It was a quiet afternoon in the city, the kind where people moved at their own pace, lost in daily routines. At a busy parking lot outside a shopping center, an elderly black woman carefully made her way between the rows of cars. She wasn't in a hurry, but fate had its own plans. With a slight misstep, the edge of her shopping bag scraped against the sleek, polished surface of a luxury car. Before she could react, an angry voice cut through the air. A man stormed toward her, his face twisted in outrage. He pointed at the faint scratch on his car, his words laced with disdain. Others turned to watch, their eyes filled with curiosity, judgment, or silent amusement. But the woman remained calm. Without raising her voice, she reached for her phone and dialed a number. The conversation was brief, just a few words exchanged. Then, she simply stood there, waiting. 5 minutes later, everything changed. The man kept ranting, his voice rising with each passing second. "Do you have any idea how much this car costs? Do you think you can just walk away after scratching it?" Some bystanders murmured, a few shaking their heads, while others watched in anticipation, waiting to see how the scene would unfold. But the elderly woman remained unfazed. She tucked her phone back into her pocket, adjusted her shawl, and simply looked at the man with a quiet, unreadable expression. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the parking lot, its tinted windows reflecting the afternoon sun. The door opened, and out stepped a sharply dressed man in a tailored suit, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement as he approached. The moment the car owner saw him, his anger wavered. "Ma'am," the suited man said respectfully, giving the elderly woman a slight nod. He handed her a set of keys. "The paperwork has been finalized. The car is now yours." Silence swept through the crowd. The angry man's mouth hung open, his face draining of color. "What?" he stammered, glancing between the suited man and the woman. "What's going on?" The elderly woman finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "You assumed I was beneath you, that I couldn't afford to fix this mistake. Instead of treating me with respect, you chose to humiliate me." She turned the keys in her fingers before extending her hand. "Now, I own the car, and I think you owe me an apology." The onlookers gasped. The arrogant man swallowed hard, his pride and fury at war with the sudden realization that he had just insulted the car's new owner. A heavy silence settled over the parking lot. The once arrogant man, his face still twisted in disbelief, stood frozen. The bystanders who had initially watched with amusement now looked on with astonishment. Whispers rippled through the small crowd, but the elderly woman remained poised, her hand still outstretched. The man glanced at the suited gentleman, who simply nodded as if to confirm the impossible truth. This car, the one he had so passionately defended, no longer belonged to him. I don't understand," the man finally managed to say, his voice quieter now. The elderly woman exhaled softly as if she had seen this scenario play out countless times before. "Understanding comes when you choose to see beyond appearances," she said. "But for now, I'm waiting for my apology." The man clenched his fists, his pride warring with the weight of the moment. He had spent the last several minutes berating this woman, dismissing her as insignificant. And yet, here she stood, graceful, powerful, and to his utter humiliation, in control. The murmurs among the onlookers grew louder. Some shook their heads at the man's arrogance, while others smiled in quiet admiration for the elderly woman's quiet strength. The suited man cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Perhaps I should explain," he said, looking between the two. "This lady here is Mrs. Eleanor Brooks." The name sent a ripple of recognition through the crowd. A young woman in the back gasped. "Wait, the Eleanor Brooks, the CEO?" The man's face turned ghostly pale. His breath hitched. Eleanor Brooks. The name carried weight in the business world. A self-made entrepreneur, philanthropist, and owner of multiple luxury brands, including, ironically, the very company that manufactured the car he had been so protective of. The man stumbled over his words. His arrogance had blinded him so completely, that he had failed to recognize one of the wealthiest and most influential women in the city. Mrs. Brooks remained patient, her gaze unwavering. "You see," she continued, "a simple scratch on a car isn't worth raising your voice, especially not to a stranger. Respect is free, yet some people act as if they can't afford it." The man swallowed hard. He wanted to disappear, to rewind time and undo his mistake. But there was no escape now. His only choice was to confront the truth and his own shame. I'm sorry," he finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Brooks tilted her head slightly. "Louder." The man's throat tightened, but he took a deep breath. "I'm sorry," he repeated, this time clear enough for everyone to hear. She studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good. Now I have a decision to make." The man blinked. "A decision?" Mrs. Brooks twirled the keys between her fingers. "I could drive away in this car and leave you here to reflect on your actions. Or I could do something unexpected." The man looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" She smiled. "Tell me, do you truly value this car?" "Yes," he blurted out immediately. I've worked hard for it. It's my dream car." Mrs. Brooks studied him again as if weighing something in her mind. Then, to everyone's shock, she extended the keys toward him. "Then prove to me you've learned something today," she said. "This car is yours again, but on one condition." The man stared at the keys, his hands trembling. "What condition?" She smiled knowingly. "From this day forward, you will treat every person you meet with dignity and respect, whether they drive a luxury car or carry groceries on foot. No more assumptions, no more arrogance, just kindness." The man hesitated. Could he promise such a thing? Could he let go of the arrogance that had defined him for so long? The crowd held its breath, waiting for his answer. The man's fingers twitched as he stared at the keys dangling before him. His throat tightened, his pride clashing with the unexpected turn of events. Just moments ago, he had been consumed by anger and self-righteousness, belittling an elderly woman he assumed was beneath him. Now, that same woman was offering him not just forgiveness, but a lesson that could change him forever. A heavy silence stretched between them. The crowd waited, their eyes shifting between the two figures. Some seemed hopeful, others skeptical. Finally, with a deep breath, the man reached out and accepted the keys. His hands trembled as he clenched them in his palm. I promise," he said, his voice quieter than before but sincere. He met Mrs. Brooks's gaze, this time with humility rather than entitlement. "I'll change." Mrs. Brooks studied him, her expression unreadable at first. Then a small smile appeared. "Good," she said simply. The crowd began to disperse, murmurs of astonishment and admiration floating through the air. Some people still whispered about the identity of Eleanor Brooks, while others reflected on the unexpected lesson they had just witnessed. The man, still reeling from the moment, looked down at the car he had almost lost because of his own arrogance. It didn't feel the same anymore. It no longer felt like just a status symbol, a thing of pride. Instead, it now carried weight, responsibility. Mrs. Brooks turned to leave, walking toward the black sedan that had brought her here. As she reached for the door handle, she paused and glanced back. "One more thing," she said. The man straightened, listening intently. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "But if you truly mean what you just promised, prove it. Not just today, but every day after this." He swallowed hard and nodded. "I will." With that, Mrs. Brooks stepped into the sedan. The suited man who had accompanied her nodded respectfully before following her inside. Within seconds, the car pulled away, leaving the man standing alone in front of his vehicle, the weight of his newfound lesson settling deep in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt small, not in a humiliating way, but in a way that reminded him there was still room to grow. As he slid into the driver's seat, his fingers traced the steering wheel. He took a deep breath and started the engine. But before he could drive off, he caught his own reflection in the rearview mirror. He didn't recognize himself, not entirely, and maybe that was a good thing. This was only the beginning. The man sat in the driver's seat for a long time, gripping the steering wheel. His heart still pounded, but not from anger. This time it was something else. Shame? Reflection? Maybe both. He had thought himself superior, quick to judge, quick to belittle. But in just a few minutes his entire perspective had been shattered by a woman he had assumed was insignificant, and now the car he had fought so hard to defend felt different. Less like a possession, more like a reminder. With a deep breath, he finally put the car in gear and drove off. For days after the incident, he couldn't shake the feeling. Every time he passed a stranger, every time he parked his car, he heard Mrs. Brooks's voice in his mind. Prove it, not just today, but every day after this. But one evening he found himself at a cafe, stirring a cup of coffee absent-mindedly. The world around him buzzed, people chatting, phones ringing, laughter from a distant table. But his mind was elsewhere. He pulled out his phone, hesitated, then typed Eleanor Brooks's name into the search bar. Articles flooded the screen. Self-made entrepreneur, philanthropist, owner of multiple luxury brands. He scrolled further. Known for her strict business ethics and quiet acts of generosity. One article caught his eye. Eleanor Brooks' secret to success, kindness is power. He clicked on it. People think power comes from wealth or status, Brooks had said in an old interview. But real power comes from how you treat others. Respect is a currency that never loses value. The words sat heavily in his chest. He exited the article, but instead of putting his phone away, he made a call. "Hey," he said when the voice on the other end picked up. "I need to talk to you." The next morning, he drove to an unfamiliar neighborhood, far from the luxury streets he usually visited. Here, the buildings were older, the streets narrower. He parked and stepped out, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket as he scanned the area. Then he saw her. A young woman sat behind a makeshift stall, selling newspapers and bottled water. Her clothes were faded but clean, her hands moving quickly as she handled customers. He walked up to her. "Excuse me," he said. She looked up, wary at first. "Yes?" He hesitated. "You probably don't remember me." She frowned. "Should I?" He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "A few months ago I came to this part of town. My car broke down near here. I asked for directions, but when you tried to help, I ignored you." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "That was you?" Guilt twisted in his stomach. He nodded. She scoffed. "Yeah, I remember. You looked at me like I was invisible." "I know," he admitted. "And I was wrong." She crossed her arms. "Why are you here now?" He exhaled slowly. "Because I want to be better." For a moment she said nothing. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she shrugged. "Well, you're off to a good start." A small, uncertain smile tugged at his lips. Maybe change was possible after all. The young woman studied him for a moment longer, her arms still crossed. She had every reason to dismiss him, to wave him off as just another man with a guilty conscience. But something in his face was different now. He wasn't looking past her like before. This time he truly saw her. "All right," she said finally, shifting her weight. "Let's say I believe you. What now?" He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a neatly folded envelope. "I don't expect this to make up for the way I treated you, but I want to help." He handed it to her. She frowned, but took it, unfolding the paper inside. Her eyes widened. "A job application?" she asked. He nodded. "My company is hiring. I pulled some strings to fast-track your interview. I know it's not much, but I figured you deserve a real opportunity." She stared at the paper, then back at him. "Why would you do this?" "Because someone once gave me a second chance," he admitted, the memory of Mrs. Brooks still fresh in his mind. "And I want to do the same for someone else." For a long moment she didn't speak. Then she let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "You're full of surprises." He chuckled. "I'm still getting used to it myself." She studied him again, her sharp gaze searching for any trace of insincerity. Finally, she nodded. "All right, I'll give it a shot." His shoulders relaxed. "Good." As he turned to leave, she called out, "Hey." He stopped. "What's your name?" He smiled slightly. "Daniel." She nodded. "I'm Mia. I'll see you at the interview, Daniel." He nodded back. "Looking forward to it." A week later, Daniel sat outside a familiar office building, sipping his coffee as he watched the city move around him. People bustled past. Business people, students, delivery workers, street vendors. For the first time, he didn't see them as background noise. He saw them as people, each with their own stories, their own struggles. And for the first time, he understood that power wasn't about wealth or possessions. It was about how you used what you had to lift others. His phone buzzed, a message from Mia. "I got the job." Daniel smiled. As he looked up at the skyline, he thought of Mrs. Brooks, of her lesson, of how a single moment, a single act of kindness could change a person forever. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly at peace.